The
We wanted to tell
champagne
you
glass
both
slipped from his
we're having
hand
a
the
baby.
moment he saw her.
Baby.
For 3 years, Julian Vance thought he had won. He had the billions. He had the power. He had the 23-year-old supermodel on his arm. He thought he had left his boring, barren ex-wife behind forever. But tonight, in the most
By
exclusive
optimizing these
restaurant
routes,
in New
we
York
project
City,
a 20%
his entire
increase in
world shattered.
efficiency across
There
the
she
board.
was, not crying, not broken, but glowing, heavily pregnant, wearing a 15-carat diamond, and holding the hand of the one man
thought you
Julian
could
was
destroy
absolutely
me.
terrified to cross.
But I'm taking everything,
His
starting
ex-wife
with your
had
reputation.
not just moved on. She had married a billionaire 10 times richer than him, and she was carrying the baby that Julian had told her she could never have. But here's the twist that will make your jaw drop. The real reason they could not have children for 10 years? It was never her fault. Julian had been hiding a secret so dark, so humiliating, that he paid a doctor thousands of dollars every month to keep it buried. And tonight, in front of everyone who mattered, that secret was about to explode. This is a story of betrayal, karma, and the sweetest revenge you will ever hear. But I have to warn you, what happens next will shock you. And the ending, you will never see it coming. Stay with me until the very last word. Trust me, you do not want to miss this. The divorce papers arrived on our 15th wedding anniversary. I remember staring at the elegant script of my name, Sarah Elizabeth Vance, typed so neatly on the first page. The document sat between us on the dining room table I had set with our wedding china, the candles I had lit casting dancing shadows across the words that would end my life as I knew it. Julian checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He always checked his watch when he was anxious. After 15 years of marriage, I knew every one of his tells, the way he drummed his fingers on his thigh, the slight twitch at the corner of his left eye, the way he could not quite meet my gaze. "I need more, Sarah," Julian said, his voice flat as if he were reading a quarterly earnings report. "I need someone who fits my future, not my past." I did not cry. I think that surprised him. He had prepared for tears, for pleading, for the desperate bargaining of a woman who had built her entire world around him. But the tears would not come. Instead, I felt something cold settle in my chest, like ice forming over a lake. "Is it because of the baby?" I asked quietly. "Because we have not been able to conceive?" Julian sighed, rubbing his temples the way he did when he found me tedious. "It is not just that. It is everything. You are stagnant, Sarah. You are happy being a nobody. I am a shark. Sharks die if they stop moving. You are an anchor around my neck." I looked at the man I had loved since I was 22 years old. The man whose hand I had held when we filed for our first business license in a cramped office in New Jersey. The man who used to bring me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. The man who had cried on my shoulder when his father died. That man was gone. Or maybe he had never existed at all. "Who is she?" I asked. Julian blinked. "What?" "The woman you are leaving me for." I said it calmly, though my heart was shattering into 1,000 pieces. "What is her name?" His silence told me everything. The late nights at the office, the business trips that seemed to multiply. The way he had stopped touching me months ago, I had known. Somewhere deep in my bones, I had known. "Her name is Tiffany," Julian finally admitted. "She is 23. She is a model, and she makes me feel alive." 23. I was 40 years old. I had given this man 15 years of my life, had sacrificed my own career to manage the books while he built his empire, had endured 6 rounds of IVF that left me broken and bleeding and hollow. And he was leaving me for someone who was barely old enough to remember the towers falling. "I want the divorce finalized quickly." Julian stood up, buttoning his jacket. "My lawyers will be in touch. I have a flight to catch." "A flight," I repeated. "Where are you going?" "Maldives." Julian said it without shame. "Tiffany has never seen the Indian Ocean." He walked out the door without looking back. I sat at that table for 3 hours. The candles burned down to nothing. The dinner I had spent all day preparing grew cold, and somewhere around midnight, the tears finally came. They did not stop for 6 weeks. The divorce settlement was generous in the way that Julian always was when he wanted to assuage his guilt. I received the house in Connecticut, which I sold immediately because I could not bear to walk through rooms haunted by memories of a love that had been a lie. I received a lump sum that seemed enormous until I realized it was less than 1% of what Julian was worth. and I received my freedom. Though at the time, it felt more like a prison sentence. I moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, a two-bedroom walk-up with creaky floors and a radiator that clanged like a dying orchestra every night. My old friends from the Vance Global days stopped calling. I suppose they had to choose sides, and Julian controlled the social calendar. My sister flew in from Ohio and stayed for 2 weeks, holding me while I sobbed and making sure I ate something other than stale crackers and cheap wine. But eventually she had to go back to her own life, her own family, her own problems. And I was alone. The worst part was the silence. After 15 years of being Julian Vance's wife, of attending galas and board meetings and charity functions, the silence was deafening. No one needed me. No one called. I was 40 years old, childless, and invisible. I spent my days applying for jobs I was overqualified for and my nights staring at the ceiling, wondering where I had gone wrong. Had I not been pretty enough? Smart enough? Interesting enough? Julian's words echoed in my head on an endless loop. You are stagnant. You are an anchor. You are nobody. Maybe he was right. One night, about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself standing on my tiny balcony at 2 in the morning. It was February, and the cold cut through my thin robe like a knife. I looked down at the street below, 6 stories down, and for one terrifying moment, I understood how easy it would be to simply let go. The thought scared me so badly that I stumbled back inside and called my sister, sobbing. You are not nobody, Sarah, my sister said firmly, her voice rough with sleep but steady with conviction. You are the woman who built Vance Global from the ground up. You are the woman who managed a $50 million portfolio before you were 30. You are brilliant and capable, and you have so much life left to live. Do not let that man take that from you too. I did not entirely believe her, but I stayed inside. I made myself a cup of tea, and the next morning I made a decision. I was done being a victim. If Julian Vance thought I was an anchor, I would prove him wrong. I would build something of my own, something that had nothing to do with him. I just had no idea that decision would lead me to Alexander Sterling. The lobby of Sterling Maritime headquarters was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings of glass and steel, a waterfall that cascaded down 3 stories into a pool of perfectly still water, security guards who looked like they could bench press a sedan. I clutched my portfolio to my chest and tried not to look as terrified as I felt. It had been 4 months since the divorce, 4 months of rejection letters and awkward interviews, and the slow, painful process of remembering who I was before I became Mrs. Julian Vance. I had updated my resume, highlighting my 15 years of experience managing the financial operations of a logistics empire. I had bought a new suit, a navy blue number that made me look professional and serious, and not at all like a woman who had spent the previous night crying into her pillow. And now I was here, interviewing for a position as a senior financial analyst at the largest shipping conglomerate in the Atlantic. The salary was good, the benefits were excellent, but more importantly, this was a chance to prove to myself that I was more than just a discarded wife, that I had value beyond being an accessory to a powerful man. Mrs. Vance, a young woman in a crisp white blouse, approached me with a clipboard. Mr. Sterling will see you now. I followed her to the elevator, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The elevator rose smoothly, silently, carrying me up 40 floors to the executive suite. I had done my research on Alexander Sterling. Everyone in the business world knew of the Iron Duke, the man who had turned his father's struggling shipping company into a global empire. He was known for his ruthlessness, his brilliance, and his complete lack of patience for incompetence. He had been married once, briefly, to a socialite who had left him for a Saudi prince. He was 45 years old, worth an estimated $30 billion, and by all accounts, utterly terrifying. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that was somehow both minimalist and opulent. A single orchid sat on the receptionist's desk, perfect and white. Go right in, the assistant said. He is expecting you. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked through the door. Alexander Sterling stood with his back to me, gazing out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered at the temples. When he turned, I understood immediately why they called him the Iron Duke. His eyes were gray, cold and penetrating. They swept over me with the efficiency of a scanner assessing cargo. Mrs. Vance, his voice was deep, resonant, with just a trace of an accent I could not place. Please sit. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, trying to project confidence I did not feel. I reviewed your resume. Alexander settled into his own chair, his movements economical and precise. 15 years at Vance Global. You managed their financial operations during their expansion from a regional carrier to a national logistics network. Yes, I said. I handled everything from payroll to investor relations. I built their accounting systems from the ground up. And yet, you have been unemployed for 4 months. The observation stung, but I refused to flinch. I took some time to reassess my priorities after my divorce. Alexander's expression did not change. I am aware of your divorce. I am also aware that Julian Vance has been telling anyone who will listen that you were dead weight, that you contributed nothing to his success, that he built his empire despite you, not because of you. My face flushed with humiliation. I see. I do not believe him. I looked up, startled. Alexander leaned forward, his gray eyes boring into mine. I have done my own research, Mrs. Vance. I have spoken to the suppliers and vendors you worked with over the years. I have reviewed the financial records from Vance Global's early days, before Julian hired a team of accountants to take credit for your work. I know exactly how much of that company was built by your hands. I did not know what to say. For 4 months, I had internalized Julian's narrative. I had believed I was worthless. And here was this terrifying titan of industry telling me I was wrong. Why are you interviewing me personally? I asked. Surely you have HR staff for entry-level positions. This is not an entry-level position, Alexander said. I am offering you a role as Director of Financial Strategy. You would report directly to me. The salary is $400,000 per year, plus bonuses and equity. I nearly choked. That is 5 times what I was expecting. You are worth 10 times what Julian Vance paid you, Alexander replied calmly. He kept you small because your competence threatened him. I have no such insecurities. I stared at him, trying to process what was happening. Why? Why would you do this for someone you have never met? For a long moment, Alexander was silent. Then he said something that changed everything. Because I know what it is like to be discarded, to be told you are worthless by someone who should have cherished you. My ex-wife left me for a wealthier man and told the tabloids I was cold and unlovable. It took me years to realize that her cruelty said nothing about my worth and everything about her character. He paused. I see the same look in your eyes that I used to see in my mirror, the look of someone who has been broken by a lie. I cannot fix what Julian did to you, Mrs. Vance, but I can give you a chance to prove the lie wrong. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I blinked them back. I had cried enough. When do I start? I asked. Alexander Sterling smiled. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges, revealing something almost warm beneath the ice. Monday, he said. Welcome to Sterling Maritime. I walked out of that building feeling something I had not felt in months. Hope. My first month at Sterling Maritime was the hardest of my professional life. Not because the work was too difficult. The work was challenging, yes, but challenge was something I had always thrived on. The difficulty came from unlearning 15 years of making myself small. At Vance Global, I had learned to speak softly, to defer to Julian in meetings, to present my ideas as suggestions rather than strategies. I had learned to take credit quietly, to let my husband shine while I worked in the shadows. I had become so good at being invisible that I had forgotten how to be seen. Alexander Sterling did not allow invisibility. In my first board meeting, I presented an analysis of our Pacific shipping routes that I had prepared with meticulous care. I spoke quickly, apologetically, ending every sentence with an upward inflection that turned statements into questions. Stop. Alexander interrupted me mid-sentence. He looked around the table at the assembled executives, then back at me. Mrs. Vance, you have identified an inefficiency in our supply chain that could save this company $40 million annually. Why are you presenting this information as if you are asking for permission to exist? My face burned. I apologize. Do not apologize, Alexander said firmly. Do not ask. Tell us. You are the expert in this room. Act like it. I took a deep breath, I straightened my spine, and I started over. This time I spoke clearly, confidently. I presented my findings as facts, not suggestions. I answered questions directly instead of hedging. By the end of the presentation, 3 board members had asked for copies of my full report, and the CFO had recommended immediate implementation of my proposed changes. After the meeting, Alexander stopped me in the hallway. "Better," he said. "That was much better." I felt a warmth spread through my chest that I did not entirely understand. "Thank you for pushing me. I do not give compliments. I do not mean." Alexander replied, "You have a brilliant mind, Sarah. It is time you started using it without apology." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the hallway with my heart beating faster than it should. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into my work with an intensity I had not felt in years. I arrived early and stayed late. I analyzed every shipping route, every vendor contract, every line item in our budget. I found inefficiencies that had been costing the company millions. I proposed solutions that no one had considered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to remember who I was. I made friends too, real friends, not the society wives who had abandoned me after the divorce. There was Margaret, the head of HR, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had worked her way up from the mailroom. There was Daniel, the young analyst in my department, who reminded me of myself 20 years ago, hungry and eager to prove himself. There was Elena, the formidable head of legal, who terrified everyone except me because I recognized the softness she hid beneath her sharp edges. And then there was Alexander. I did not understand my relationship with Alexander Sterling. He was my boss, technically, though he rarely acted like one. He treated me as an equal, soliciting my opinions on decisions that had nothing to do with my department. He invited me to strategy meetings I had no business attending. He remembered details about my life that I had mentioned only in passing, like my preference for chamomile tea or my habit of reading historical biographies. Sometimes I caught him watching me across the conference table, his gray eyes unreadable. I told myself I was imagining things, that a man like Alexander Sterling could not possibly be interested in a discarded ex-wife with emotional baggage and a biological clock that was rapidly ticking toward midnight. But sometimes, late at night in my Brooklyn apartment, I allowed myself to wonder. It was Margaret who finally said what I had been too afraid to think. "He likes you, you know," she said one afternoon, stopping by my desk with a coffee. "And I mean likes you, not just as an employee." I laughed nervously. "That is ridiculous. He is Alexander Sterling. He could have any woman in the world. He does not want any woman." Margaret replied, "He wants someone who challenges him, someone who is not afraid to disagree with him, someone who sees him as a person, not a portfolio." She gave me a knowing look. "Sound like anyone you know?" I did not have a response to that. 3 months into my time at Sterling Maritime, I received an invitation to the company's annual gala. It was a black tie affair at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the kind of event that attracted celebrities and politicians and captains of industry. The kind of event where I might run into Julian. I almost declined. The thought of seeing my ex-husband, of enduring his smug smile and condescending remarks, made me physically ill. But then I thought about everything I had accomplished in the past 3 months, the respect I had earned, the confidence I had rebuilt. I was not the broken woman Julian had thrown away. I was someone new, someone stronger. I bought a dress I could not quite afford, a midnight blue gown that made me feel like a queen. I hired a stylist to do my hair and makeup. And when I walked into the gala on my own 2 feet, I held my head high. "Sarah." The voice came from behind me, deep and warm. I turned to find Alexander Sterling standing there in a tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body. He looked devastating. "You look beautiful," he said simply. And the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in a room of 500, made me believe him. The gala was a blur of champagne and conversation, of air kisses and business cards, of the kind of performative networking that I had always despised. But Alexander stayed by my side throughout, introducing me to investors and board members, making sure everyone knew that I was someone important. It felt strange being treated as valuable. Strange, but wonderful. Around 10 o'clock, we found ourselves on a balcony overlooking Central Park, escaping the noise and heat of the crowd inside. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of the city below. "You are different tonight," Alexander observed, leaning against the railing beside me. "Different how?" "More yourself." He turned to look at me, his gray eyes softer than I had ever seen them. "When you started at Sterling, you were a shadow, apologizing for existing, second-guessing every word. But tonight you walked into that room like you owned it." I smiled slightly. "I had a good teacher." Alexander shook his head. "I did not teach you anything you did not already know. I just reminded you that you knew it." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lights of the city sparkle below us. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said finally. "You can ask me anything. Why did you really hire me?" I turned to face him. "And do not give me the speech about recognizing potential. I know there is more to it." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more intimate. "I hired you because when I read your personnel file from Vance Global, I saw my own story." He paused. "I was not always the Iron Duke, you know. No, when I took over this company from my father, it was drowning in debt, and everyone expected me to fail. My wife at the time told me I was embarrassing her by clinging to a sinking ship. She wanted me to sell and live off the proceeds. When I refused, she left. 'I am sorry,' I said softly. 'Do not be. It was the best thing that ever happened to me,' Alexander replied, 'because it forced me to find out who I was without her. It forced me to build something real, something that was mine alone.' He looked at me intently. 'When I saw what Julian had done to you, I recognized the same moment. The moment when everything falls apart and you have to decide whether to drown or swim. And you wanted to help me swim. I wanted to give you the opportunity I wish someone had given me.' I felt tears threatening again. But these were different. These were not tears of grief or self-pity. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of something deeper that I was not ready to name. 'Alexander,' I whispered. And then, before I could think better of it, I kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tentative and questioning. For one terrible moment, I thought I had made a mistake, that he would pull away, that I would have to resign in humiliation, that I had just destroyed everything I had worked so hard to build. But Alexander did not pull away. He kissed me back with a tenderness that took my breath away. His hand came up to cup my face, gentle as if I were made of glass. When we finally broke apart, he was smiling. "I have wanted to do that since your first board meeting," he admitted. I laughed, a genuine laugh that bubbled up from somewhere I had forgotten existed. "Why did you not?" "Because I wanted you to find yourself first," Alexander said. "I wanted you to know that whatever happened between us had nothing to do with gratitude or vulnerability or power dynamics. I wanted you to choose me as an equal." "I am choosing you," I said, "as an equal." That was the night everything changed. We took things slowly at my insistence. I needed to be sure that what I felt for Alexander was real, not just a rebound from Julian or a response to being rescued. Alexander understood. He was patient in a way that Julian had never been, giving me space when I needed it and presence when I needed that instead. We had dinner twice a week, always at quiet restaurants where we would not be recognized. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. Books we loved, places we wanted to visit, dreams we had abandoned, and dreams we still held close. I learned that Alexander donated half his income to children's hospitals, a fact he had never publicized because he believed that charity done for recognition was not charity at all. He learned that I had once wanted to be a writer, that I still kept a journal filled with stories I was too afraid to share. One night, about 6 weeks into our relationship, Alexander asked me about the journals. "Will you let me read one?" he asked. We were walking through Central Park after dinner, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. I felt my face flush. "They are not very good, just ramblings. Silly stories." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face me. "Sarah, how many times did Julian tell you that your thoughts were not worth sharing?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I, I do not know, many times. "And how many times did you believe him?" I looked down at my shoes. "Every time." Alexander lifted my chin with gentle fingers. "Your voice matters. Your stories matter. and I would be honored to read them whenever you are ready to share. That night, for the first time in 15 years, I pulled out my journal and read my own words without cringing. They were not perfect, but they were mine, and maybe that was enough. We did not sleep together for 3 months. When we finally did, it was in his penthouse overlooking the Hudson, with the city lights glittering below us like a promise. "I love you, Sarah," Alexander said afterward, holding me against his chest. "I know it is too soon. I know I should wait, but I have never been good at lying, and that is the truth." I pressed my face into his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. "I love you too," I whispered, "and I am terrified." "Terrified of what?" "Of being happy," I admitted. "Every time I have been happy, it has been taken away. I am waiting for the other shoe to drop." Alexander tightened his arms around me. "Then we will face the shoe together, whatever comes." I am not going anywhere. I believed him. I should not have been so confident, because the other shoe was about to drop in a way I never could have predicted. 2 weeks later, I took a pregnancy test. It was positive. I stared at the two pink lines for so long that my vision blurred. Positive. After 10 years of trying with Julian, after 6 rounds of IV that had left me bruised and broken, after being told by doctor after doctor that conception would be extremely unlikely without medical intervention, after Julian had called me barren on our last anniversary, his voice dripping with disgust. Positive. I took another test, then another, then 3 more using different brands because I could not believe what I was seeing. All positive. I called my gynecologist and made an emergency appointment, sat in the waiting room with my hands shaking, certain that there had been some mistake. False positives happened. Rarely, but they happened. But the blood test confirmed what the plastic sticks had told me. I was pregnant. 8 weeks along, the baby was healthy. "How is this possible?" I asked Dr. Martinez, my voice barely above a whisper. "My previous doctors said I could not conceive naturally." Dr. Martinez pulled up my old records on her computer, scrolling through years of test results and treatment notes. She frowned. "Mrs. Vance, actually it is Ms. Vance now, correct?" She looked at me over her glasses. "I am seeing some irregularities in your previous testing. The diagnosis of diminished ovarian reserve was made by a Dr. Thorne, is that right?" "Yes, he was Julian's preferred specialist. Julian insisted we use him." Dr. Martinez's frown deepened. "I am not sure how to tell you this, but Dr. Thorne lost his medical license last year for falsifying test results for wealthy clients. There were allegations that he told couples whatever they wanted to hear as long as they kept paying for treatments." The room tilted. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that your previous diagnosis may not have been accurate," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Looking at your current hormone levels and the health of this pregnancy, I see no evidence of the fertility issues you were supposedly diagnosed with. You appear to be a perfectly healthy woman with a perfectly healthy pregnancy." I walked out of that office in a daze. For 10 years, I had blamed myself. For 10 years, I had believed I was broken, defective, unable to give my husband the children he wanted. For 10 years, I had endured the humiliation of treatments that may never have been necessary. But something Dr. Martinez said kept echoing in my mind. Dr. Thorne told couples whatever they wanted to hear. What had Julian wanted to hear? That night, I could not sleep. I lay in Alexander's arms, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through memories I had tried to bury. Julian had always been the one to speak with Dr. Thorne privately. Julian had always been the one to relay the test results. Julian had always been the one to suggest that maybe we should just accept that children were not in our future. Had he known, Sarah, Alexander's voice was soft in the darkness. "You are trembling. What is wrong?" "I need to tell you something," I whispered. "But first I need to investigate something." "Can your security team access medical records?" Alexander sat up, his expression serious. "What kind of medical records?" I told him about Dr. Thorne, about the falsified diagnoses, about my suspicion that Julian had known more than he had ever admitted. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that changed everything. "I will find out everything." 3 days later, Alexander's team delivered a file to my office. It was thick, filled with documents and photographs and bank statements that painted a picture so horrifying I had to read it twice to believe it. Dr. Thorne had not just falsified my records. He had been on Julian's payroll for years, receiving monthly payments of $10,000 to ensure that the fertility treatments never worked. The injections I had received, the ones that had made me so sick, had been placebos. The procedures I had endured had been theater. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the second diagnosis buried in the file. A diagnosis that Dr. Thorne had been paid to hide. Julian Vance had been diagnosed with azoospermia, zero sperm count, 5 years before our divorce. The cause was listed as prolonged abuse of anabolic steroids and testosterone supplements. Julian had known. He had known for 5 years that he was the reason we could not have children. And instead of telling me, instead of being honest, he had paid a corrupt doctor to blame me. He had let me suffer through invasive procedures. He had called me barren on our anniversary. He had used my supposed infertility as justification for leaving me for a younger woman. And the whole time he was the broken one. I did not cry. I was beyond tears. I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest, a rage so pure it was almost peaceful. "What do you want to do?" Alexander asked, watching me carefully. I looked up at him, at this man who had shown me what real love looked like. "I want to destroy him," I said calmly. "But not yet. First, I want him to see exactly what he threw away. I want him to watch me thrive. And then, when he is at his lowest, I want him to know that I know the truth." Alexander nodded slowly. A cold smile crossed his face. "I married the right woman." We were married 6 weeks later in a private ceremony on Lake Como. I wore a simple white dress that accommodated my growing belly. Alexander wore a gray suit that matched his eyes. My sister flew in from Ohio and cried through the entire ceremony. It was small and intimate and absolutely perfect. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that Julian would not take this well. I just did not know how badly he would react. The night of the confrontation started like any other. Alexander and I had dinner reservations at L'Orangerie, a tiny French restaurant in the Upper East Side that served the best duck confit in the city. I was 7 months pregnant by then, enormous and uncomfortable and craving red meat with an intensity that alarmed my obstetrician. We were seated in a private alcove near the piano, away from the main dining room. Alexander pulled out my chair for me, a gesture that still made me smile after 6 months of marriage. He could command boardrooms and terrify competitors, but with me, he was gentle as a lamb. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling across from me. "Like a whale that swallowed a watermelon," I replied. "But a happy whale." Alexander laughed, that rare, warm sound that I had come to treasure. "You are the most beautiful whale I have ever seen." We ordered our food and settled into easy conversation. Alexander told me about a new acquisition he was considering. I told him about a cost-saving initiative I had proposed that morning. We talked about nursery colors and baby names and whether we should hire a night nurse or try to manage on our own. I was happy, genuinely, completely happy in a way I had not thought possible. And then I saw him. Julian was across the restaurant, seated at a booth near the window with a young brunette in a red dress. Even from a distance, I could see that he looked older, more tired than I remembered. The stress of running Vance Global without me was clearly taking its toll. But it was the woman who caught my attention. She was not Tiffany. This was someone new, younger if that was possible, with the same hungry look in her eyes that Tiffany had once worn. So he had already moved on. Some things never changed. Alexander followed my gaze. His expression hardened. "Do you want to leave?" "No," I said, surprising myself. "I am done running from him." I turned back to my husband, determined to enjoy my evening. But I could feel Julian's eyes on me, could sense the moment when recognition dawned. I heard the crash of a glass breaking, followed by a woman's shrill voice. A few minutes later, a shadow fell across our table. "Sarah." Julian's voice was hoarse. "You look different." I looked up at my ex-husband. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. "I am different," I said calmly. Julian's eyes dropped to my belly, to the prominent bump visible even beneath my elegant maternity gown. Then to my ring finger, where the 15-carat emerald-cut diamond Alexander had given me caught the candlelight. "You are pregnant," Julian said it like an accusation. "Yes. We tried for 10 years," his voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. The doctors said you were barren, that you could not carry a child. Alexander was on his feet in an instant, placing himself between Julian and me. His voice was soft and dangerous. Watch your tone, Vance. I stood up slowly, placing my hand on Alexander's arm. I can handle this. Alexander looked at me, then nodded and stepped aside. But he did not sit down. He stood like a sentinel, ready to intervene if necessary. Julian, I said, keeping my voice steady, I am going to say this once, so listen carefully. The doctors never said I was barren. You told me they said that. You told me a lot of things that turned out to be lies. Julian's face flushed. I do not know what you are talking about. No, I tilted my head. So you did not pay Dr. Thorne $10,000 a month to falsify my fertility records? You did not hide your own diagnosis of azoospermia for 5 years? You did not let me suffer through 6 rounds of fake IVF while knowing the whole time that you were the one who could not have children? The color drained from Julian's face. How did you find out about that? Does it matter? I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the fear in his eyes. For 10 years, you let me believe I was broken. You let me cry myself to sleep wondering what was wrong with me. You used my supposed infertility as an excuse to cheat, to lie, to throw away our marriage. And the whole time, Julian, the whole time you were the one shooting blanks. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every eye was on us. That is not. Julian stammered. The diagnosis was wrong. Dr. Thorne said there was still a chance. Dr. Thorne lost his license for fraud, I replied. But you knew that already, did you not? Because you were paying him to lie. Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse. And then Tiffany appeared. I had not seen her come in, but suddenly she was there, pushing past the hostess, her face twisted with rage. You. Tiffany jabbed a finger at Julian. I just got a call from my lawyer. You froze my credit cards. You changed the locks on the apartment. What the hell is going on? Julian turned pale. Tiffany, this is not the time. Not the time? Tiffany shrieked. You promised me you were leaving her. She gestured at the young brunette still sitting at Julian's table. You promised me I was the only one. And now I find out you have been sleeping with your assistant for 6 months? The brunette stood up, her face crimson. I am not his assistant anymore. I am his girlfriend. Girlfriend? Tiffany laughed bitterly. Honey, you are his placeholder, just like I was, just like she was, she pointed at me. He cycles through women like they are disposable. Did he tell you about the vitamin injections too? The ones that made him infertile? I felt Alexander's hand on my back, steadying me. The pieces were falling into place. Tiffany had known. She had known about the steroids, about the infertility, probably about the fake diagnoses too. You knew, I said to Tiffany. You knew what he did to me. Tiffany's expression shifted. For a moment, I saw something like regret in her eyes. I've found the medical records 6 months after you divorced, she admitted. I was looking for his will. I wanted to know how much I would get if something happened to him. Instead, I found out that the whole time he was calling you defective, he was the defective one. And you said nothing. What was I supposed to do? Tiffany shrugged. By then, you were already with Sterling. You were already winning. Besides, she smiled cruelly at Julian, I was planning to use it as leverage for a better settlement. But then he started sleeping with Little Miss Assistant over there, and I realized I was never going to get anything. Julian looked between the 3 women, his face ashen. This is a nightmare. This cannot be happening. Oh, it is happening, I said. I stepped forward until I was inches from his face. You spent 15 years making me feel worthless. You convinced me I was barren, that I was an anchor, that I was nobody. And the whole time, Julian, you were projecting. You were the worthless one. You were the one who was broken. And now everyone knows it. I turned to Alexander. I have lost my appetite. The air in here has become very stale. Agreed, Alexander said. He signaled to the maitre d' with a single raised finger, then placed a protective hand on my back. We walked toward the exit, leaving Julian standing in the middle of the restaurant, surrounded by his mistress, his ex-mistress, and the ruins of his reputation. But I was not done yet. I stopped at the door and turned back. One more thing, Julian, I said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. I have copies of Dr. Thorne's records, the real ones, the ones showing exactly what you did. They are currently sitting in a safe deposit box. But if you ever come near me or my family again, they will be on the front page of every newspaper in this city by morning. Julian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Goodbye, Julian, I said. I hope the view from rock bottom is everything you deserve. I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high. Behind me, I could hear Tiffany's voice rising in accusation, the brunette's voice cracking with tears, and Julian's futile attempts to salvage something from the wreckage. But I did not look back. I was done looking back. I thought it was over. I was wrong. Julian's lawsuit arrived 2 weeks later. He was claiming paternal rights to my unborn child, alleging that I had stolen his frozen genetic material from the fertility clinic. But that was not all. He was also suing me for defamation, claiming that my accusations at the restaurant had damaged his reputation and cost him business relationships. He was demanding $50 million in damages and full custody of the baby. The lawsuit was absurd, baseless, clearly the desperate act of a man watching his carefully constructed reality crumble around him. But absurd or not, it still had to be fought. I wanted to handle it quietly, to let our lawyers deal with Julian and his ridiculous claims while I focused on preparing for my baby's arrival. But then I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a woman named Rebecca Chen. She introduced herself as a former employee of Vance Global, and she had a story to tell. Mrs. Sterling, Rebecca said, her voice trembling, I worked in accounting at Vance Global for 12 years. I know things that could help you, things that Mr. Vance would do anything to keep hidden. What kind of things? I asked. The kind of things that could put him in prison. Rebecca paused. But I need protection. I have been too scared to come forward. He threatened me when I tried to report what I had found. He said he would destroy my career, ruin my reputation, make sure I never worked in this city again. I thought about everything Julian had done to me, the laws, the manipulation, the systematic destruction of my self-worth. And now here was another woman, another victim, reaching out for help. Come to my office tomorrow, I said. I will make sure you are protected, and I will make sure your story is heard. Rebecca's story was worse than I had imagined. For years, Julian had been embezzling money from the Vance Global Employee Pension Fund, millions of dollars siphoned off to pay for his lifestyle, his mistresses, his luxury cars and private jets. Rebecca had discovered the discrepancies when she was promoted to senior accountant. When she tried to report them, Julian had called her into his office. He told me that if I said anything, he would tell everyone I had been stealing. Rebecca wept as she recounted the story. He said he had set up fake evidence, fake accounts in my name. He said no one would believe a nobody accountant over a billionaire CEO. He said he would destroy me. What did you do? I asked. I kept quiet. Rebecca wiped her eyes. For 5 years, I watched him steal from the people who trusted him, the secretaries, the janitors, the warehouse workers who were counting on that pension for their retirement. I watched him take everything, and I said nothing because I was afraid. You are not saying nothing, Chanel. I reached across the table and took her hand, and I am going to make sure that everyone knows the truth. Alexander assembled a legal team that looked like something out of a movie. Elena from our legal department, 3 partners from the most prestigious law firm in New York, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud, a private investigator who had once worked for the FBI. Within days, they had uncovered everything, Dr. Thorne's falsified records, showing that Julian had been sterile for at least 5 years before our divorce. Bank statements documenting the embezzlement from the pension fund, testimony from Rebecca and 3 other former employees who had been intimidated into silence, evidence of bribes to government officials, evidence of tax fraud, evidence of securities manipulation. We had enough ammunition to destroy Julian 10 times over. But I did not want destruction. I wanted justice. There is a difference. Let me talk to him. I said to Alexander the night before we were scheduled to appear in court. One conversation. Just the 2 of us. Absolutely not. Alexander's voice was sharp with worry. He is dangerous, Sarah. He is cornered and desperate. There is no telling what he might do. Alexander, please, I need to do this. I took his hands. For 15 years, Julian had all the power. He spoke and I listened. He decided and I followed. I need him to hear me, really hear me, one time. And I need to hear myself say the things I should have said years ago. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. I will be right outside the door. If he raises his voice, if he makes any kind of threat, I am coming in. I kissed him. Thank you for trusting me. The meeting took place in a conference room at our lawyer's office. Julian was already there when I arrived, looking haggard and diminished in a suit that no longer fit properly. He had lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes. The arrogant CEO, who had once commanded boardrooms, now looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Sarah, Julian stood up as I entered. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I sat across from him, keeping the wide conference table between us. I did not agree to see you out of kindness, Julian. I agreed because I want this over. And I thought you might prefer to settle quietly rather than have all your secrets exposed in open court. Julian flinched. Secrets? I slid a folder across the table. Take a look. Julian opened the folder with trembling hands. I watched his face as he flipped through the pages. The medical records, the bank statements, the sworn testimony, the evidence of every crime he had committed over the past decade. How did you get this? He whispered. Your problem, Julian, is that you always underestimated me, I said quietly. You thought I was too stupid to notice, too weak to fight back, too broken to rebuild. You were wrong about all of it. Julian looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. What do you want? He asked. I leaned forward. I want you to drop the lawsuit. All of it. The custody claim, the defamation suit, everything. I want you to sign a document stating that you have no claim to my child and that you will never contact me or my family again. And I want you to turn yourself in to the SEC and the FBI. Turn myself in? Julian laughed bitterly. You want me to go to prison? I want you to face the consequences of your actions, I replied. For the first time in your life, and if I refuse, then everything in that folder goes public. Tomorrow morning, every newspaper, every news channel, every financial blog in the country will have copies. Your investors will flee. Your board will remove you. Your company will collapse. And you will still go to prison, but without any chance of a deal. Julian stared at me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he started to laugh. I really did underestimate you, he said. All those years, I thought you were just the quiet woman behind the curtain, the support staff, the footnote to my success story. But you were the one who made it all work. Were you not? You were the one who built the foundation while I took the credit. Yes, I said simply, I was. Julian's laughter faded. He looked down at the folder in his hands, at the evidence of his own destruction. You know what the funny thing is? He said quietly. I was terrified of you. All those years, terrified that you would realize you did not need me, that you would see through the act and find the frightened little boy underneath. So I tore you down. I made you doubt yourself. I made you believe you were the problem. I know, I said. And in the end, I pushed you away anyway. Julian closed the folder. The thing I feared most became my own doing. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. I was not ready for that. But something like understanding. Julian was not a monster. He was a coward. A frightened, insecure man who had destroyed everything he touched because he could not face his own inadequacy. It did not excuse what he had done, but it explained it. Drop the lawsuit, Julian, I said. Turn yourself in. Get help. Find some peace. Because this path you are on, this obsession with destroying me, it will only destroy you faster. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. I will drop it, he said. I will sign whatever you want. I will turn myself in. He looked up at me with something that might have been respect, but not because you are threatening me. I will do it because that child deserves better than a father who cannot let go of his ego, even a father who is not really his father. It was the first selfless thing I had ever heard Julian say. I stood up to leave. Then I paused at the door. One more thing, Julian, I said. The employees you stole from, the pension fund, when you turn yourself in, make sure you tell them where the money went. They deserve to know, and they deserve to get it back. Julian nodded slowly. I will. I walked out of that conference room and into Alexander's arms. "It is over?" he asked. "It is over." I confirmed. He is dropping the lawsuit, and he is turning himself in. Alexander held me tight. "I am proud of you. I did not destroy him," I said. "I could have, but I did not. I know." Alexander pressed a kiss to my forehead. "That is why I am proud. You could have been cruel. You chose to be just." 2 weeks later, Julian Vance was arrested by the SEC for securities fraud, embezzlement, and bribery. The investigation made national news. Vance Global's stock plummeted. The board removed Julian as CEO and appointed an interim leader to begin the process of making the pension fund victims whole. We had not destroyed Julian. He had destroyed himself. But for the first time in 15 years, I was free. Leo Alexander Sterling came into the world on a rainy Tuesday in March, screaming with all the fury of his father and all the determination of his mother. I held him in my arms and wept. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair and gray eyes that would later darken to match Alexander's. He was 7 pounds and 3 ounces of miracle, of impossibility, of everything I had spent 10 years believing I could never have. Alexander sat beside my hospital bed, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son nurse for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for him. Thank you for everything." I smiled through my exhaustion. "We made him together. You made him," Alexander corrected. "I just provided raw material. You did the hard work." I laughed, wincing at the pull of my stitches. "If you start calling me a vessel, I am divorcing you." "I would never." Alexander leaned over to kiss my forehead. "You are not a vessel. You are a warrior, a creator, a goddess." Life with a newborn was harder than I had imagined, and I had imagined it would be hard. The sleepless nights, the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing, the constant worry that I was doing something wrong, that I was not equipped for this monumental responsibility. But I was not alone. Alexander was there for every midnight feeding, every diaper blowout, every moment of panic when Leo's cries sounded different and I was sure something was terribly wrong. He had hired a night nurse over my objections, but more often than not, he was the one rocking Leo back to sleep while I caught a few precious hours of rest. "You do not have to do this," I told him one night, finding him in the nursery at 3 in the morning, Leo cradled against his chest. "You have meetings tomorrow. You need to sleep." "I have spent my entire life chasing success," Alexander replied, not looking away from our son's face. "Building an empire, proving my worth. But none of it means anything compared to this moment. This small, perfect person who depends on us for everything." He finally met my eyes. "I would burn Sterling Maritime to the ground if it meant one more moment with my family." I believed him. But even in the midst of this overwhelming joy, the past found ways to intrude. 3 months after Leo was born, I received a package at the office. There was no return address, just my name written in a feminine hand I did not recognize. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "Mrs. Sterling," the note read, "I know we did not part on good terms, but I thought you should have this. Consider it my apology for staying silent when I should have spoken up. Tiffany." I stared at the note for a long moment. Then, with trembling hands, I plugged the USB drive into my computer. It contained hundreds of files, photographs, voice recordings, text messages, a complete archive of Julian's lies, dating back years before our divorce. There were recordings of Julian bragging to Tiffany about fooling me with the fake fertility treatments. There were text messages where he laughed about how easy it was to manipulate his boring wife. There were photographs of Julian with other women, women I had never known about, women who predated Tiffany by years. And there was one final document, a prenuptial agreement that Julian had been planning to present to Tiffany, one that would have given her nothing in the event of a divorce. Tiffany had not been his partner. She had been his next victim. I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to be angry at Tiffany for staying silent for so long, but a larger part of me understood. She had been trapped, just like I had been. Manipulated, just like I had been. The only difference was that she had gotten out before Julian could destroy her completely. I wrote her a short email. "Thank you for this. I hope you find peace. Sarah." 3 days later, I received a response. I am trying. Good luck with the baby. He is beautiful. I saw the pictures in the magazine. It was not forgiveness, but it was a start. The first year of Leo's life passed in a blur of milestones and exhaustion and overwhelming love. His first smile at 6 weeks, gas or not, it counted. His first laugh at 4 months, prompted by Alexander making ridiculous faces. His first word at 11 months, which was, to Alexander's endless delight, Dada. Mama was next. I forgave him eventually. I returned to work when Leo was 4 months old, but on a reduced schedule that Alexander had arranged without my asking. 3 days a week in the office, 2 days working from home. It was not enough to satisfy my professional ambitions, but it was enough to keep me sane. And then, when Leo was 18 months old, I discovered I was pregnant again. Grace Elena Sterling was born on a snowy December morning, 2 weeks before Christmas. She had her father's dark hair and my stubborn chin and a cry that could shatter glass. 2 children, 2 miracles. After a decade of believing I would never be a mother, sometimes, late at night, I would stand in the doorway of the nursery and watch my children sleep. Leo in his toddler bed, Grace in her crib, both of them peaceful and perfect, and completely unaware of the storm their mother had weathered to bring them into the world. I had spent so many years believing I was broken, believing I was worthless, believing I did not deserve happiness. I had been wrong about all of it. When Leo was 3 years old, I received a letter. It came to my office at Sterling Maritime, hand-delivered by a courier from the Federal Correctional Facility in Otisville. The envelope was plain white, the handwriting cramped and unfamiliar. I almost threw it away without opening it, but something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe, or perhaps the sense that some circles need to be closed before they can truly end. I opened the letter. Sarah, it began, I do not expect you to read this. I would not read it if I were you, but I need to write it anyway, even if it ends up in your trash where it probably belongs. I am not writing to apologize. An apology would be an insult, a bandage on a wound that I inflicted deliberately and repeatedly over 15 years. I am writing because I have had a lot of time to think in here, and I have finally started to understand some things. I loved you, Sarah. Not well and not enough, but I loved you in the only way I knew how, which is to say, I loved what you could do for me. I loved how you made me look. I loved that you were always there, steady and reliable, while I chased every shiny thing that caught my eye. I did not love you the way you deserve to be loved, the way Alexander Sterling loves you. I have seen the pictures in the magazines, the way he looks at you like you hung the moon. I used to think it was an act, rich people performing happiness for the cameras. But I have had a lot of time to study those pictures, and I have realized that no one is that good an actor. He loves you, really loves you, and you love him. I am glad. I know that sounds like a manipulation, another Julian Vance scheme to get something I want, but I have nothing left to scheme for. My company is gone. My reputation is destroyed. My freedom will not be my own for another 5 years at least. All I have is time. Time to think about who I was and who I could have been. I wasted 15 years with you, Sarah. I had a partner who would have walked through fire for me, and I threw her away for a woman who left me the moment my credit card stopped working. I had a chance at a family, at real happiness, and I sabotaged it with my own insecurity and greed. I read somewhere that the grass is not greener on the other side. It is greener where you water it. I did not water anything. I just kept looking for greener grass, never realizing that I was standing in a garden. I hope Leo is healthy and happy. I hope your daughter is too. Yes, I know about Grace. The magazines again. You have a beautiful family, Sarah. The family I could have had if I had been a better man. Do not write back. Do not visit. Do not waste another moment of your life on me. Just know that somewhere in a cell in upstate New York, there is a man who finally understands what he lost, and who hopes, more than anything, that you never look back. Julian. I read the letter 3 times, then I folded it carefully, placed it in my desk drawer, and went home to my family. 3 more years passed. Leo started kindergarten, a milestone that made me cry for an entire morning. Grace took her first steps on her 2nd birthday, toddling across the living room into Alexander's waiting arms. Sterling Maritime continued to grow, and with it, my role in the company evolved from financial analyst to co-CEO, a position Alexander had insisted on despite my protests. "You built half of this," he said when I tried to decline. "You deserve to be recognized for it." Life was not perfect. No life is. Alexander and I argued sometimes, usually about work or the children, or which one of us had forgotten to call the plumber. Leo went through a biting phase that got him sent home from school twice. Grace developed a fear of thunderstorms that kept us up through many stormy nights. But even in the difficult moments, I never forgot how lucky I was, how close I had come to a very different life, a life of invisible desperation, of quiet despair, of believing the lies that Julian had planted in my head. "You are stagnant. You are an anchor. You are nobody." Those words did not hurt anymore. They were relics of a past self, reminders of a woman I no longer was. One evening, about a year after I received Julian's letter, I found myself alone in the garden of our Connecticut estate. Alexander had taken the children to visit his brother in the city. I had stayed behind, claiming work, but really just needing a moment of solitude. The garden was beautiful in the fading light, roses and hydrangeas, carefully tended by a gardener we employed, but that I often joined on weekends because I had discovered, to my own surprise, that I loved growing things. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing a plant from seed to bloom, about creating beauty from dirt and water and patience. I thought about Julian's letter. "The grass is greener where you water it." I had watered this garden, this life, this family. Every day, with intention and care, I had chosen to invest in what I had rather than chase what I did not. And it had bloomed. "Mrs. Sterling?" I turned to find Margaret standing at the edge of the patio. She had retired from Sterling Maritime the previous year, but still visited often. She was more family than employee at this point. "Margaret," I smiled, "I thought you were in Florida." "I was." Margaret walked over to join me, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. "But I heard some news and thought you should know." She hesitated. "Julian Vance was released from prison last week. Early release for good behavior." I felt a flicker of something. Not fear exactly, not anger, more like the distant echo of a thunderstorm that had long since passed. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Are you all right?" I considered the question. 5 years ago, the news would have sent me spiraling. I would have worried about Julian seeking revenge, about him trying to disrupt my life, about the past reaching out to drag me back into its grip. But I was not that woman anymore. "I am fine," I said, and meant it. "He cannot hurt me anymore. Not because he has changed, but because I have." Margaret nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "You have come a long way, Sarah." "I have," I agreed. "But I did not do it alone. I had help. From you, from Alexander, from everyone who believed in me when I could not believe in myself." Margaret reached out and squeezed my hand. "You would have found your way regardless. The strength was always inside you. We just helped you remember it was there." I did not hear from Julian. Not that week, not that month, not in the years that followed. Perhaps he had taken his own advice and decided not to look back. Perhaps he had found some measure of peace in his own garden, whatever that looked like now. I hope so, not for his sake, but for my own. Carrying hatred was exhausting, and I had better things to do with my energy. Leo turned 8, Grace turned 5. Alexander and I celebrated our 7th wedding anniversary with a trip to Lake Como, retracing the steps of our honeymoon while the children stayed with my sister. "You know what I was thinking?" Alexander said one evening, as we watched the sun set over the lake. "What?" "That this is exactly where I want to be in another 7 years, and another 7 after that." He turned to look at me, his gray eyes soft with love. "Wherever you are, Sarah, that is where I want to be." I leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I spent so many years believing I was not enough," I said quietly, "that I was broken, that I did not deserve happiness. And now I know that the only person who can determine my worth is me," I smiled, "and I have decided that I am priceless." Alexander laughed. "That is because you are." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade over the water. In the distance, church bells rang, marking the hour. I thought about all the versions of myself I had been. The young woman who had fallen in love with a charming entrepreneur. The devoted wife who had sacrificed her own dreams for her husband's ambition. The broken shell of a person who had stood on a balcony at 2 in the morning and considered letting go. And the woman I was now, mother, wife, CEO, survivor, fighter, creator of my own destiny, all those versions were part of me, but they did not define me. I defined myself. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed with Julian? Alexander asked softly. I considered the question. I used to. In the early days, when everything felt uncertain, I used to wonder if I had made a mistake. If the devil you know is better than the devil you do not. But now I shook my head. Now I know that staying would have killed me. Maybe not physically, but the woman I was becoming, the woman who had hopes and dreams and something to offer the world, that woman would have died. Julian would have smothered her completely. So you have no regrets? Only one, I said. I wish I had left sooner. I wish I had not wasted 15 years waiting for him to see my worth instead of seeing it myself. Alexander pulled me close. You were not ready. You had to grow into the woman who could leave. And you did. That is what matters. I pressed my face into his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him. I love you, Alexander Sterling. I whispered. I love you too, Sarah Sterling, Alexander replied. More than words can say. We stayed there until the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the beauty of a place where our family had begun. And I was grateful. For all of it, every moment, even the terrible ones. Because without the darkness, I would never have found my way to the light. The Sterling Gala for Children's Health became an annual tradition. Every December, we opened our Connecticut estate to 500 of New York's most influential people, raising millions for pediatric hospitals and children's charities. It was Alexander's passion project, born from his own lonely childhood and his determination to give other children better starts than he had received. I loved the galas, not for the glitter and glamour, though there was plenty of that. I loved them because they represented everything we had built together, the merging of wealth and purpose, the transformation of privilege into responsibility. The gala in our 10th year of marriage was the biggest yet. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the guests arrive. The women in their designer gowns, the men in their perfectly tailored tuxedos, the tinkle of champagne glasses and the murmur of sophisticated conversation. 10 years ago, I had been invisible at events like this, a shadow behind Julian, smiling when expected, silent when convenient. Now I was the host, the philanthropist, the woman whose name opened doors and whose opinion shaped policy. Mom. Leo appeared at my elbow, looking uncomfortable in his miniature tuxedo. Do I have to stay for the whole thing? Tommy's having a sleepover, and they are playing the new Zelda. You can leave after the speeches, I promised. But first, come with me. There is someone I want you to meet. I led him through the crowd to where a small, elderly woman sat in a wheelchair near the fireplace. Her name was Dorothy Chen, and she ran the children's hospital that would receive the largest portion of tonight's donations. Mrs. Chen, this is my son, Leo, I said. Leo, Mrs. Chen is the reason thousands of children get the medical care they need every year. Leo straightened up, suddenly serious. It is nice to meet you, Mrs. Chen. My mom talks about you a lot. Dorothy's weathered face crinkled into a smile. Your mother is a remarkable woman, young man. She does more good in a day than most people do in a lifetime. She just really likes helping people. Leo said simply. She says that is what money is for. Not for buying stuff, but for making things better. I felt my heart swell with pride. After all my worrying about whether I was raising my children right, whether I was spending enough time with them, whether my career was stealing moments I would never get back, here was proof that something had gotten through. Your son is wise, Dorothy said to me. You have done well. I have had help, I replied, catching Alexander's eye across the room. He smiled at me, that private smile that was meant for me alone, and I felt the familiar warmth spread through my chest. The speeches began at 9 o'clock. Alexander spoke first, his deep voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He talked about the importance of giving back, of using privilege as a platform for change, of remembering that the true measure of success was not what you accumulated, but what you contributed. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. Some I knew well. Some were strangers, but all of them were here because they believed in the cause we were championing. 10 years ago, I began, my voice steady and clear. I was at the lowest point of my life. I had lost my marriage, my identity, my belief that I had anything of value to offer the world. I thought my story was over. I paused, letting the silence settle. I was wrong, I continued. My story was just beginning. I just could not see it yet. I talked about my journey, not the details, not the drama, but the broader arc, the despair and the rebuilding, the discovery that strength often looks like vulnerability, the realization that asking for help is not weakness, but wisdom. Someone once told me that the grass is not greener on the other side, I said. It is greener where you water it. For years, I was looking for greener pastures, never realizing that I had the power to grow my own garden all along. It took losing everything to understand that the only thing I truly needed was already inside me. The capacity for growth, the resilience to start over, the courage to believe that my best days were still ahead. I looked at Alexander, at Leo sitting beside him, at Grace asleep in my sister's arms. Tonight, we are raising money for children who are fighting battles no child should have to fight. But we are also celebrating something else. We are celebrating second chances, new beginnings, the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to heal and thrive and bloom. I raised my champagne glass. To gardens, I said, may we all have the wisdom to water our own, and may we all find the courage to start again. No matter how many times life knocks us down, the applause washed over me like a wave. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Alexander and I walked through the garden. The December air was cold, but we were warm in our coats, our hands intertwined. You were magnificent tonight, Alexander said. I had good material to work with, I replied. I mean it, Sarah. He stopped walking, turning to face me. You have built something extraordinary. Not just the foundation, not just the gala. You, the person you have become. I am in awe of you every single day. I reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that had deepened over the years. Lines of laughter, lines of love, lines of a life well lived. I could not have done it without you, I said. You could have, Alexander said firmly. You would have. It might have taken longer. It might have looked different. But you would have found your way. Because that is who you are, Sarah. A survivor, a fighter, a woman who refuses to be defined by anyone else's opinion of her worth. I thought about Julian, somewhere out there living his own life. I thought about Tiffany, who had moved to California and started a nonprofit for domestic abuse survivors. I thought about all the people who had counted me out, who had looked at the broken woman crying over divorce papers and assumed the story was over. They had all been wrong. Do you ever regret it? Alexander asked quietly. The pain you went through? Everything Julian did to you? I considered the question seriously, as I always did with Alexander. No, I said finally, because without the pain, I would not be here. I would not have Leo and Grace. I would not have you. I would not know how strong I actually am. The pain was terrible, but it was also a teacher, and I learned from it. What did it teach you? I smiled. That I am enough. That I was always enough. That the only person who can take away my worth is me, and I refuse to do it ever again. Alexander pulled me close. That is the most Sarah answer possible, I laughed. What does that mean? It means you have a gift for finding meaning in suffering, for transforming wounds into wisdom, for taking the worst things that happened to you and using them to become better, not bitter. I learned that from watching you be. I said softly. Alexander shook his head. No, that was always inside you. I just helped you remember it was there. We stood there in the winter garden, surrounded by dormant roses and the promise of spring. The stars were bright overhead, and our breath made small clouds in the cold air. I used to think that happiness was something that happened to you, I said, something outside your control. But now I know that happiness is a choice, a practice, something you build day by day, moment by moment, with the people you love. And are you happy? Alexander asked. I looked at him, at this man who had seen me at my worst and loved me anyway, at this partner who had held my hand through the darkness and celebrated with me in the light. I am happier than I ever thought possible, I said, and I am grateful for all of it, every moment, even the terrible ones, because they led me here, to you, to our children, to this life we have built together. Alexander kissed me softly. Then we will keep building, every day. until we are old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren who think we are the most boring people in the world. I laughed. That sounds perfect. We walked back to the house together, our footprints leaving matching trails in the frost. Behind us, the garden slept, waiting for warmth and water and patient care. Ahead of us, the lights of home glowed golden in the darkness. I had started this story as Julian Vance's invisible wife. I had become Sarah Sterling, but that was not the most important transformation. The most important transformation was inside. I had become the author of my own narrative, the gardener of my own soul, the creator of my own destiny. And that story, the real one, was still being written, one beautiful day at a time. As I walked through the door, Leo came running down the stairs in his pajamas. "Mom," he said urgently, "I could not sleep. I was thinking about what you said in your speech, about the grass being greener where you water it." "What about it, sweetheart?" Leo looked at me with his father's serious gray eyes. "Does that mean if you take care of something, it grows, like our garden?" I knelt down to his level. "That is exactly what it means." "Then I want to grow something," yeah, Leo said. "Not flowers, something real, something that helps people, like what you and Dad do." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "We can do that. What did you have in mind?" Leo thought for a moment. "Tommy's little sister has to go to the hospital a lot. She has cancer. Tommy is really sad. Can we help her?" Alexander appeared at the top of the stairs, having heard the conversation. He came down and put his hand on Leo's shoulder. "We can definitely help her," Alexander said. "And we can help other kids like her too. Would you like that?" Leo nodded eagerly. "Yes, I want to water the garden, like Mom said." I pulled my son into my arms and held him tight. Somewhere in the house, Grace was sleeping peacefully. Outside, the garden waited for spring. And all around us, the life we had built together pulsed with love and purpose and infinite possibility. This was my garden. This was my family. This was my second chance, and I would water it, nurture it, and help it grow for the rest of my days. And that is the story of Sarah Sterling, a woman who lost everything and built something even more beautiful from the ashes. If this story made you feel something, if it made you angry at Julian, if it made you cheer for Sarah, if it reminded you that your best days might still be ahead, then do me a small favor. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, but it helps more than you know. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who is going through a hard time, someone who feels like they are not enough, share this story with them. Sometimes a story can change everything. Drop a comment below. Tell me, would you have forgiven Julian? Or do you think he got exactly what he deserved? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your thoughts. And if you are new here, welcome to the family. Hit subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss another story. I post new videos every week, and trust me, the next one is going to be even more dramatic than this. Remember, the grass is not greener on the other side. It is greener where you water it. Your garden is waiting. All you have to do is start watering. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next story.